Committee. As with all of our meetings, this meeting is being recorded. With that, I will pass it along to Chair Jamalian to address some housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. Chair Jamalian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikesh. Welcome, Cannabis Oversight Committee members, general public, Office of Cannabis. Before we get started, a couple of quick opening remarks. Today is a pretty important day, as San Francisco cannabis community knows. Our consumption lounges are open for business again, which is a pretty important step in supporting social equity and our existing MCDs who all had, some of them who had lounges. So one of the agenda points, DPH, will take a minute to explain the current regulations as well as the fee waiver program for those consumption lounges. That being said, I'll also ask DPH to give us a little view on what will trigger a closing or a reopening of these lounges, so our operators will have a little bit more guidance on how to, operate their lounges. They've been closed for years, so that was really difficult on most of them. And yeah, that's going to be the agenda. We're having a presentation, part 2 of the data presentation from the Office of Cannabis, and that is going to conclude my opening remarks. So before we get started, public comment from members of the public. Please note that you'll all have an opportunity to speak to every point. There'll also be a general public comment section at the end of the meeting. So try to stay focused on the current point, or if you have a more general comment, save that for the end of the meeting. Committee members are not permitted to engage directly with your comments, but we will obviously always try to address your concerns reflected in our agenda and our motions. At this point, I will now pass on to David for agenda item number 1, roll call.
Thank you, Chair Jamalian. We'll proceed. If you could just state present when your seat and our name is called, we appreciate it. Seat 1, Department of Public Health, Mohamed Mali.
Present.
Thank you. Seat 2, from the Police Department, we have either Captain Brian Philpott or Sergeant Chris Oshida here. Or any other representatives from the Police Department, Seat 2. We'll mark that absent for the time being. Seat 3, DBI. We have a representative from DBI, either Jeff Buckley, Patrick O'Riordan. Absent. Seat 3 is absent. Seat 4 from the Planning Department, Michael Christensen.
Present.
Thank you, Michael. And Seat 5 from SF Unified School District, Corey Pak.
Present.
Thank you. Seat 6, which is Entertainment Commission. Do we have a representative here today?
Yes.
From Entertainment?
Dylan Rice, present. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Welcome. Seat 7 from the SF Fire Department. Lieutenant Rick Vergari or Lieutenant Dennis Sy. Okay, for the time being. Moving on to our voting members. Seat 8, our chair, Ali Jamalian.
Present.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Present.
You. Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Present.
Present, thank you. Seat 11, Doug Block. Absent. Seat 11 is absent. Seat 12, Sean Richard. Sean, are you still with us?
Me?
C12, Sean Richard. I think Sean was just with us, so it might be a technical difficulty. We'll circle back. Seat 13, Nina Parks. Nina Parks is absent today. Please mark that in the notes. Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Present.
Thank you, Brendan. Seat 15, Teresa Foglia Ramirez. Okay, absent for the time being. Seat 16, Sarah Pan.
Present.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Chair Jamalian, to my count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 voting members at present, which gives us just a minimum for quorum at the moment. I can reach out to Member Richard to see if he needs support.
Thank you, David. But agenda item is now closed and we have quorum. So we'll move on to agenda item number 2. Another bit of housekeeping. We've had this every time, or recently, for having the virtual meetings. We do need to adopt the agenda item number 2, findings in motion, to allow teleconference meetings. So if you guys can each take a minute to look at the screen. Again, this is just a formality. We got to do it anyway. So take a look and then let's make a motion to pass this.
Motion to pass the resolution as written.
We have a second.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. David, can you take a vote, please?
Yes. It looks like also, Chair, that Sean is with us and asked to be unmuted. I'll go forward with the vote. Seat 8, Ali Jamalian.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 12, Sean Richard. Can you hear us? Okay. Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Aye.
And seat 16, Sarah Payne.
Aye.
So the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, David. Agenda item 2 is now closed. Moving on to number 3. This is the review of the minutes for approval for today's meeting. So if you guys don't mind taking a quick look at the agenda, as I had mentioned, we have a couple of points regarding consumption lounges and the OOC presentation. Please.
Chair Jamalian, just a quick question. For agenda item 2, did you open it up to public comment?
Oh, sorry, my bad. We didn't.
So in terms of process, Chair Jamalian, what will happen is you'll reopen item 2, you'll open it up to public comment. Then once public comment has been provided, if there is any, then you can ask for a motion and vote on adopting the findings.
The resolution. Okay. David, Ray, could we open up for public comment then?
Sure. Chair Jamali. So members of the general public who want to provide public comment on this particular agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input the access code, which is 2488-933-5496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I'm going to check the attendee list to see if there is any caller waiting in the queue. Seeing none. And I'm also going to check the chat box. Chair Jamalian, we don't have any written comments submitted to this item.
Okay, so public comment is closed and we will need a motion to adopt.
I'll motion.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. We get a vote.
Seat 8, Ali.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan.
Aye.
Don't know, seat 12, Sean, can you hear us and put in your vote? Not yet. Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan,
Aye.
and seat 16, Sarah.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, on second attempt, agenda item 2 is now closed, so we can move on to agenda item number 3. This is reviewing today's agenda. So if everybody would take a minute, David, maybe you can put it up on the screen so we can review today's agenda and open it to public comment before approving it.
Are you able to see my screen, Chair Jamali?
Yes.
Okay.
Do we want to have any discussion about our meetings going back to in-person meetings? Chair? Or
Well, I think given the new health orders, that's probably a pretty good idea. As far as I remember, we were actually aiming for this one to be in person and changed it back to virtual, right, Nikesh? Or
That's correct.
And thanks for bringing that up. So our understanding is that guidance around in-person meetings is sort of a fluid issue, and so it has been changing with the surge of Omicron and sort of where we are with COVID right now. As far as I understand, the requirement that these meetings be back in person applies to a certain type of advisory body, specifically a commission. It does not necessarily apply to this body, is my understanding. And so it is a question before the committee about whether or not there's a desire to return to in-person. Certainly can have that conversation, but in terms of the delay from the initial date, the real delay was around hospitalization rates and where we were with COVID. But new guidance suggests that it's not mandatory that this body moves back to in-person meetings unless there is an overwhelming desire. And to keep in mind that if this body was to move back into in-person settings, it may not have the support of audio-visual equipment to tape those meetings that would be available to commissions, given that commissions must return to in-person meetings. The same doesn't hold true for advisory bodies like this one.
thank you, Nikesh.
do you want to have that discussion amongst the committee members and at some point on this agenda? I don't know. I don't necessarily need to do it now, but maybe at the end, get everyone's opinion on whether or not we should try to come back to in-person meetings, or if it's preferred to continue on this path.
I think it's fair to add I think it's fair to add like a 5-minute slot to the end of this meeting before general public comment, just to kind of see what the appetite of the committee members is.
I think that would be a good idea.
We do see that we have technical difficulties quite often with voting members. So, I mean, even that, having those voting members present and having their voice heard would be a motivation for me to say, let's do them in person.
Also makes us more accessible to people who attend afterwards and so forth.
I can appreciate those views, but as somebody with a compromised immune system and who has a husband who has one, I would be much safer being home as a cancer survivor and somebody with issues with my immune system. I am not in favor of starting to meet in person till it's safer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to that point, those are the point we need to hear everyone's viewpoints, because obviously we would not want to risk anyone's health over meeting in person either. I think we're all pretty aligned on that one. And thanks for sharing that, Sarah.
Do we need to make a motion to amend it, or is that some subsequent? Or...
I think we need public comment first, and then we can make our motions. And if everyone is okay with the the point of the discussions that we just had, then I would open up for public comment, unless any committee member wants to also share their view, like Sarah, Brendan, and I just did.
I'm curious on what the scope of opening it up to in person. Would we, is it an all or nothing thing? Could voting members attend but not attendees, and have attendees still do virtual? Or, I mean, is there a threshold for that, or is there a possibility to have just the voting members there and attendees still do virtual, I guess is the question.
And to chime in here, if this is an item that you'd like to add to the end of the agenda, then we, as members of the OC, can certainly provide some context to help. I think right now it's just a question of whether you want to add that item to the agenda, but we might have some information that could provide some color to your question, Chair Member.
Well, then let's open up for public comment, and then after that, we'll make a motion to dedicate a little bit of time to that.
Chair Jamali, before we open this up to the public comment section, I just want to provide a logistical note here for agenda item that will be added, for example, to this meeting, because this is not post online to inform the public in advance. So we can talk about that, but I don't believe this body can take action, for example, by voting on a particular action on this particular item. So it's all to say we can talk about that if we decide to add this to today's agenda, but we may not be able to take vote on any kind of decision that will be made.
Understood. So that we could then push to the actual vote to the next agenda. But I do think we should have that discussion quickly to Brendan and Sarah's point as well.
Okay. All right. So now we are opening this agenda item for public comment. Members of the general public who want to provide public comment on this particular agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input the access code, which is 24889335469, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your comment. Chair Jamalian, I do see one person waiting in the queue, and I'm going to unmute this individual now. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. I'm Charlie Pappas from Divinity Tree. Really appreciate all you folks being there. It is really important we meet in person, but distance and less contact are much unnecessary, and I don't think it's there yet. So maybe in the right space. But because we're not that big a committee, and that, that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Chair Jamalian, I do not see other members from the public waiting in the queue, and I'm going to check the chat box now. So we do receive 2 public comments in the chat function. The first public comment reads, regardless in person or virtual, the public needs access virtually each time. The second public comment is submitted from an individual. Our office had received a written public comment before this meeting. Chair Jamalian, question for you. So should we read this public comment from the chat function, or should we read the public comment submitted before this meeting?
You can please go ahead and read the one that was submitted prior to the meeting.
Thank you. For additional context, before this meeting, our office received written comment for this particular agenda item, and I'm going to read this comment for the record. Hello, Oversight Committee and meeting attendees. I'm requesting a code amendment, an exemption, or a waiver for one of the permit amendments based on the changing licensing landscape. An amendment requiring a property owner letter in addition to a landlord letter was made after the cannabis program started, based on problems with applicants/operators only having landlord approval, with the disapproving property owner not made aware until later. This situation often applies to stopping retailers, but is not a factor for the Type 13 license type that I seek. Below is my recommendation for an additional amendment to the code governing cannabis permit, Section 1609B8. all cannabis applicants must submit an acknowledgement letter from the property landlord and owner, except for applicants for Type 13, which prohibits cannabis storefront on-site and public access, and for applicants with premises locations not zoned for cannabis activity, where a landlord letter will suffice. There's no legal reason to obtain a letter from the landlord of my office-based premises, who clearly acknowledges my proposed activity but cannot legally provide such a letter, instead deferring to the landlord Regis, who provided a letter. An exemption should be made when a requirement like this references a moot point, a mere technically allowed to become a full roadblock. I deserve equitable treatment, not equal treatment in this case, especially as an equity applicant with a unique business model. Background and supporting arguments. Most Type 13 licensees are transport companies, manufacturers, and cultivators seeking to self-distribute and transport their products. A few licensees with my business model are in Sacramento, though no one else in San Francisco pre-DCC equity liaison Jeanette Sim. These manufacturing and cultivation facilities are already located in cannabis zone locations where they would have already acquired a letter from the landlord/property owner for their main license with the Type 13 as an add-on. Note that the DCC later introduced the share type as a pathway to licensure for people like me who cannot afford their own facilities. Unlike the Type 13, the Type S license is listed on the San Francisco permit application. Yet, there are currently no registered share facilities in San Francisco to contract with, largely because space in San Francisco is so expensive. My only local options are in Alameda, Sonoma, and Sacramento counties. Thank you for agreeing to discuss hopefully creating an equitable solution. Best, Ringler Jackson. That concludes this written comment.
Thank you, Ray. Is there any more public comments?
Let me go back to the attendee list to check. Seeing none, Chair Jamalian, I think that concludes this public comment section.
Thank you. That concludes public comment section. Any of my fellow committee members want to discuss the letter that Ray just read out? I believe that the issue is there's a couple of things. First of all, I think it's a very granular issue. While we're here to help and advocate for the whole industry, and we want to help each individual, this is really boils down to one or two business cases or use cases. But the expressed activity permit or expressed activity consent, that's obviously an issue that some of us can shed some light upon. I know that there are some DBI issues with change of use that would require that for almost any business, but I also know that on a state level, that is required as well. And, to give it a little historic context, it obviously also has to do with asset forfeitures that were happening long before legalization. And that requires the landlords, the property owners, to obviously give some sort of assurances that they know where the income that they're generating is from. But that being said, I'll open it up to the committee members if anybody has some input and can create some context here. I'm sure the equity applicant, who obviously deserves an answer, would appreciate that.
I guess this is Brendan. Just quickly, I would probably want to just ask, I don't know if a DBI representative is on or not, but I know Michael's on. Michael may be able to help. Would it be possible to even apply for a change of use to file a building permit without an explicit authorization of the landlord? So just from experience, I believe it requires not only just the Office of Cannabis, but also to file a building permit, you need the same type of authorization. And just wanted to verify if that's correct or not with a DBI or possibly a planning representative that might know better.
Michael Christensen, Planning Department staff. My understanding is the same, that you need an authorization from a property owner to apply for any building permit in the city, including a change of use.
Okay.
Yeah, so this would be a very, very granular kind of code change, which would have to be sort of followed up by a state legislative change that would allow the state to process your annual license without that, on top of the DBI issues. I just think that this is something that's a little bit out of our reach personally as a committee. That's just my view. And again, open to discussion. If anyone has ideas, please do share them.
I agree with you, Ali. I think that it's something that needs to be addressed, but I think it might be kind of out of our area to be able to do something on that. And it's very upsetting when you think about people investing so much money in rent with hopes of having income, and then in some cases, even when one is granted permits, there can be changes with how the landlord even feels about the businesses being done. So we need to really be looking at that, and the state needs to do something about that.
Agreed. Well, that being said, I think that would conclude item number 3 if we don't have any motions on the floor. Is that?
I have one quick comment. It's actually for the Office of Cannabis. It's a question. I was trying to look it up real quick here, but I believe they're besides the landlord, there's a landlord representative that can also authorize the permit. Is that correct? Ray, do you know off the top? I'm trying to look at 1609 real quick here, because I remember seeing it in here before, but I believe you can, an authorized representative of the landlord can also provide the authorization. Is that correct?
That is correct. However, we still want a letter and explicit acknowledgement from the landlord for the activity that will be pursued by the applicant.
So the landlord couldn't use like the shield of like, for example, an attorney or the property manager or something like that to provide the authorization. It would have to be directly from the landlord.
That's right. Attorney or any representative can kind of interact with our office on behalf of the landlord. However, we do need a document, basically an acknowledgement directly from the landlord for the activity that will be at the location.
Committee members, it's also worth very much emphasizing that these are not wants of the Office of Cannabis. These are regulations in the code, and it as an office that enforces Article 16, it is a requirement of Article 16 that this explicit activity authorization letter be provided, and it shows both that the property owner has consent and provides consent for the activity that will take place on the site. So I just want to be very careful about the language there, that it's not so much a want as it is an obligation, and it's a requirement that we have to enforce. There isn't discretion here. So a minor point, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, thank you, Nikesh. And again, it's also on a state level, so it's kind of it's a two-front battle anyway, and state needs to do it first. So I think that would conclude agenda item number 3. And then I'd like to close item number 3 and move on to agenda item number 4.
Chair Jamalian, sorry, just a quick point. I know that the committee had previously discussed the possibility of a motion to add an agenda item, but I know that you had not closed the loop on there. So
sorry, that's right. Thank you. Brennan, would you like to make a motion to add the in-person meeting
to the next agenda, right? Well, for discussion today, but potentially to add to the agenda for our next oversight committee hearing?
Correct.
Okay.
And member Hallinan, just to be very clear, I know this is a process issue, but if you could articulate the motion and the numbered agenda item that you'd like to add, it'll just make it a little bit easier for the folks over at RDA to keep track in the notes.
Understood. I was trying to clarify where we ended up after Ray's comment. We're at item, so to add the discussion to item number 6 on today's agenda, as well as add the to next month agenda to have an in-person meeting or vote on in-person meeting item before the next meeting.
And if I might make a recommendation, it may make sense to just propose adding an additional agenda item after agenda item 7. So the new agenda item 8 could be for a very brief discussion around in-person meetings, and then.
Okay.
we could add it.
Motion to add agenda item 8 around in-person meetings.
Second that motion.
Okay, seat 8, how do you vote, Ali? Seat 9, Aaron?
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan?
Aye.
Seat 12, Sean? See that Sean is with us, and it just looks like he's on mute. Sean?
Aye.
Great, thank you, Sean.
Crazy.
Um,
Aye.
Thank you, Sean. Noted. Seat 14, Brendan?
Aye.
And seat 16, Sarah?
Aye.
Okay, and with that, the agenda, with the addition of the mentioned agenda item has been approved unanimously.
Thank you, David. That concludes item number 3. We'll move on to item number 4, review and approve minutes of our meeting in November. If you don't mind sharing your screen and everybody take a minute to review them, and then we'll open for public comment and subsequently approving them or altering them.
So I think a number of us have recused ourselves from that pretty large item that's in the minutes. How is that typically handled procedurally? The portion of the minutes that we were not recused from, or can we exclude that portion of the minutes that we were not, because we weren't even on the call, we went out of the meeting while that was being done. So
Certainly, one of the things that is available to the committee is that they can approve the minutes, notwithstanding the sections that a majority of the present voting members were not present for. So that is one way to move past this item on the agenda, is approving the minutes, excluding the sections that you were recused for, and you can make that clear during the vote. In this particular instance, what is a little bit trickier is if the 4 voting members who recused themselves during that particular item were to abstain from approving that section of the minutes, then there would not be quorum for the rest. So to make this most clean, the best way to move forward would be to approve the minutes as a committee, all voting members present, excluding the minutes as they relate to the conversation around grant distributions, and then approve that at a later meeting when we do have quorum for the remaining, or for the voting members who were present and constituted quorum.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Brendan, because 4 out of the 9 pages, some of us were not present for, so.
yeah.
All right, so that being said, I'd probably open up for public comment, please.
Sure. Members of the general public who want to provide public comment on this agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input your access code, which is 2488-933-5496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I'm going to check the attendee list to see if there's any individual waiting to speak. See none, and I'm going to move on to the chat function. Chair Jamalian, we do not have any written comments submitted for this particular agenda item.
Thank you, Ray. That closes public comment. Committee members, I think as Brendan just discussed, we should probably adopt these minutes, notwithstanding the portions that some of us were accused from. So if anybody wants to make a motion or further discussion, please go ahead.
I butchered the last motion, so if someone else makes it, I'll second it, but I'm not going through that again.
Well, I butchered the opening. I was like thinking German and speaking English, so it was a little bit rough, but I think we warmed up. It's been a minute since we met. Well, I think Sarah's been the most eloquent today, or Aaron's usually pretty good at this too.
I'll take a stab. Motion to adopt the minutes from last meeting, excluding the portion around grant distribution.
Second.
Great.
Thank you, David. Can we
Seat
get a vote?
8, yeah, oh, sorry. Seat 8, Ali, how do you vote? Ali, how do you vote? I'm sorry.
Aye, sorry. I forgot to unmute.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 12, Sean Richard.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Holloman.
Aye.
And seat 16, Sarah Pine.
Aye.
And with that, the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, David. That concludes item number 4. Moving on to agenda item number 5. I think we're all pretty excited to get the second part of your data presentation. At this point, I will pass the floor to Nikesh and the OOC.
Thank you, Chair Jamalian. David, if you would not mind sharing your screen, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, David. And as a prefatory note, this is a very data-rich presentation. The slides will be made available following this presentation, and I will speak to a lot of what is on the slides, but in the interest of clarity and to not bore everyone to death, I will not go into every data point that is shared. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to our office. The presentations, the slides themselves, as you will see, are fairly rich with explanatory notes. So I hope that you have time after this presentation to look through the data for yourself, to dig in a little bit more, but I will go through it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them at the end. Next slide. As Chair Jamalian mentioned, today's meeting is the second installation of a 2-part data presentation from the Office of Cannabis. The data presented in today's presentation, much like the last data presentation, is with respect to 2020, with the exclusion of revenue and sales tax data, which will be from the year 2019. I'll explain why that data is from 2019 as opposed to 2020 when we get to the portion of the presentation. As you can see here, the big items that will be covered, the remaining items that will be covered, are employee wage and demographic data from operators who responded to a survey created by the Office of Cannabis and Resource Development Associates and administered by RDA. Then we'll take a quick look at revenue and sales tax data. As a heads up, this is data that is self-reported to the Office of the Controller, and we'll provide a little bit more in terms of an explanation of how to best interpret that data when we get there. And then the last portion will be relatively brief. It's expungements in 2020. Next slide. The bulk of today's presentation is with respect to data gleaned from a survey filled out by operators who were operating businesses in 2020. And this is across the different sectors of our industry, from Article 16 permanent permit holders to MCD operators, as well as temporary permit holders. As you can see, the images on this slide are snapshots of the slide of the survey that was administered to operators. The survey itself covered a range of material, and we can get into that in the next slide. Here's what the survey covered. It asked operators to provide their business name and location, the type of permit they were operating under, the length of operation for their businesses in the year 2020, employee information. Now, this is a big component of what you'll see in the next slides, where we look at factors like full-time versus part-time employee data, the number of employees who held entry positions, operator level positions, and executive level positions, the wages of these individuals that operators are paying, and then also demographic data, specifically race, gender, and pay. The reason why we looked at that data in particular is it's part of our responsibility to inform the Cannabis Oversight Committee, and we want to make sure that the information that they're seeing about operators is reflective of the landscape. This is obviously from 2020, but the way that these data presentations will go will always be sort of a year in behind. Next slide. I've mentioned this a handful of times, but it is important to emphasize that this survey went to members of the existing industry. This includes our permanent permit holders, our temporary permit holders, and medical cannabis dispensary operators in operation in the year 2020. That's the calendar year. The total number of businesses who were outreached with this survey were 141, approximately 141. The survey, as some of you may have experienced, was administered about a year ago, around this time for about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, and it was administered through an online survey platform. As I mentioned, our office and RDA helped to design the survey. RDA administered the survey. Privacy measures were put in place to protect the confidentiality of the individuals who responded to that. And the data that's presented in the next slide is aggregate data. It does not speak to any one business. And we very much appreciate the operators who did respond. The outreach to elicit responses was extensive. As you can see here, there were 5 rounds of general and targeted follow-up emails and text communications by RDA. Next slide. The survey response rate, approximately 52 operators participated. Of these 52 operators, some partially provided responses, some provided complete responses. All of the information in these surveys is self-reported, and that is really important to remember as you interpret the data and process it, and for the committee as it makes decisions regarding what they're seeing today. On the whole, a pattern that we noticed is that participants were more likely to complete the general information questions and less willing to provide demographic data. As we get to that portion of today's presentation, you'll see that the count of individuals reflected in the data does drop off a little bit. One of the other things that we were very mindful of was trying to get a reflective sample of information from the different types of businesses across the industry. So small-sized businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large-sized businesses. We had 27 businesses and some that provided complete information to all of the questions asked on the survey. Of these 27 businesses, they did reflect the variety of business sizes in our industry. As you can see here, 6 were small-sized businesses, and that's from 1 to 4 employees. 16 were medium-sized businesses, about 5 to 9 employees, and 5 of the respondents represented larger-sized businesses with 10 or more employees. So with all that being said, this is more contextual information that's important as you process the information in the next slides, but we'll get right to it. So next slide. This is important from a definitional standpoint, and I encourage everyone here to go back and look at these definitions to understand what we meant when we said entry level versus operator level versus executive level employees, and also how we define full-time versus part-time. At the risk of boring everyone, I'm going to gloss over this portion right now, but please feel free to look back at these definitions when you're processing the information person. Next slide. The first data point of interest is we looked at job type and employment status, these 2 factors across the 27 cannabis businesses that responded in full. They responded to the survey in full. The information here reflects information for 386 employees. So that is a mere fraction of the industry as it exists today, but it does provide a snapshot. Here what we see is that the majority of positions that our respondents provided information for were for entry-level positions, and particularly in the full-time capacity. The next most staffed position was, again, entry-level, but in a part-time capacity, with the third most staffed position being at the operator level and in a full-time capacity. Next slide. One of the items I just want to flag for everyone's attention here is that you'll notice that these slides are coupled. So the previous slide is the same as this slide, but here the key takeaways have been included for everyone's edification when they're reviewing the presentation on their own. So As we go through this presentation, the first slide will be followed by a slide that has the same information, but drills down on some of the key takeaway points. Here, as you could see, and as I just mentioned, a little under half of all of the employees for whom information was provided working across the 27 cannabis businesses held entry-level full-time positions. The next most staffed position was entry-level part-time, and then the next most staffed was operator-level positions in the full-time capacity. Next slide. Here, and over the next set of 6 slides, we drill at the data by the type of position. So here we're looking at self-reported wage information for entry-level employees. We're just talking about entry-level employees here, and particularly for the 26 cannabis businesses who reported information for their 232 employees. I'm going to flip over to the next slide so we can get straight to the takeaway points. As you can see here, approximately 51% are full-time employees making anywhere between $17 to $24.99 per hour. Approximately 40% are part-time employees earning within the same range, with the majority making closer to the $17 to $20.99 an hour. And the majority of individuals, part-time or full-time, earn between $17 and $20.99. Next slide. We looked at the same level of information, but for operator level employees. So for the 21 cannabis businesses that provided information regarding their operator level employees, for 81 employees, the data sort of speaks for itself. The majority of operator level employees occupy full-time positions and are making between $25 to $29.99 an hour. On the next slide, we have a couple of additional takeaway points. Next slide. But without repeating this, the general idea here is that nearly 90% of all operators are full-time employees. I'll give everyone a moment or two just to digest this information a little bit before moving on to the next slide. Okay, next slide. Finally, we also looked at the salaries and wages of executive level employees. Now, a couple of caveats here that are important to keep in mind. We're only speaking about 31 executive level employees, and this is across 20 cannabis businesses who provided information regarding these employees. But the trend here is that the majority of executive level employees employed by cannabis businesses are in a part-time capacity and make above $30 an hour. Next slide. This is just a repetition of what I said on the previous slide, but feel free to look more closely on your own. Next slide. All right, so having looked at job type as well as the pay ranges by job type, we also decided to look at race for employees based on all job types. So here in particular, we're looking at the racial breakdown of all of the employees for whom operators provided information for across the 3 different job types, at the entry level, the operator level, and the executive level. This is data that is reflected for all 3 job types across the 344 employees for whom we received information. Next slide for the key takeaways. What you can see here is that the 3 most represented racial groups of employees are African American or Black, 19%, at 19%, Caucasian white at 30%, and Hispanic Latino or of Spanish origin at 22%. The least representative groups by race are American Indian or Alaska Native at 1%, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander at 1%, and other at 2%. With respect to this second takeaway, that is a trend that you will see across a lot of the data on the subsequent slides. And you will also see that the majority, when we speak about representation within the cannabis space, is represented through the African American or Black category, the Caucasian white category, and the Hispanic Latino or Spanish origin category. The next set of slides drill a little bit deeper and look specifically by job type as well as job type by race. So next slide, please. Here what you'll see, and again, this is self-reported demographic data by race for employees by job type. So we are looking at the racial breakdown based on the data provided by job type for the entry level, for the operator level, and for the executive level positions. Just at first glance, you can see some patterns emerging. And one is that as you look at the representation of Caucasian white individuals, you see that they are less represented at the entry level, but their representation grows across entry to operator to executive level. Whereas we see the reverse trends for African American or Black employees and Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin employees. Generally, we see their representation greater at the entry level positions, and then you see a drop off at the operator level, and then a significant drop off at the executive level. The next slide covers essentially these primary takeaway points, and then also again reiterates that in general there is limited representation of American Indian or Alaska Native, Middle Eastern, or North African, multiracial, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander or other groups in the data that we received. All right, so I will let this slide sit for a second. Please feel free to take a look. Like I said, these slides will be made available after the presentation as well. Next slide. In addition to looking at the salaries and the job types, as well as the racial representation of individuals across those two factors, we also looked at gender. And specifically, what we found is that for the 25 cannabis businesses that reported demographic data in response to this question of gender, for 344 employees, the distribution was greater towards male employees versus female employees. Almost 60% of the information provided for employees by these respondents indicated that males dominated the workspace. So specifically, the male employee percentage was around 57% of the 344 employees, and for females, around just a little over 40%. Next slide. This is just a repetition of what I said on the previous slide. Next slide. We then looked at the gender breakdown by job types. So looking at what is the gender representation of male to females in the entry level positions, across operator level positions, and across executive level positions. Again, you notice a sort of pattern here, which is the representation of males increases as you move across the different types of jobs. So from entry level to operator level to executive level, you see greater representation of males in the cannabis space for the individuals who responded to the survey, and you see the reverse trend for female representation, with the greatest representation being at the entry level and a much smaller representation being at the executive level. And then those individuals who identify as gender non-binary, you see that their representation is very limited. Now, it's very important to keep in mind that this is information that is self-reported, so it reflects the identities and the identifications of those individuals as they're responding to this. We do not have a way of double checking or confirming, corroborating this information. Next slide. Okay. These two takeaways just summarize the points I made on the previous slide, but essentially that as you look across entry level, operator level, and executive level positions, you see the representation of female decrease, and you see the representation of males in those positions increase. Next slide. Drilling even further, we looked at demographic data across race, gender for entry level positions. Here, there's a lot of information, and so what we'll do is we'll just get straight to the next slide where some of the key takeaway points are extracted. Here, what we see is that African American or Black female employees are the most represented, followed by Caucasian white males and Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin female and male employees. And again, we see that the representation of the other groups that we included in the survey, it is far more limited. Next slide. At the operator level, in looking at the information here, what you see is that females, and specifically Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin females, they occupy, well, at least of the information that's presented, at around 10%, and males have a slightly higher advantage at 13%. But what is noticeable here is that of Caucasian representation across gender lines, males are more dominant in this space at the operator level than white females are. And you see the reverse for African American females, where there's greater representation at the operator level compared to male African American male representation for this same position. Next slide. The information here repeats what I just said, but it's useful. It's useful to take a look at again when you have a little more time. Next slide. At the executive level, when you look at race and gender, you see a similar trend where the representation of Caucasian females, Caucasian white females, is much less than of male Caucasian and white representation. And then for African American or Black females, there's less of a representation at the executive level than their male counterparts. And the same is generally about true when we talk about Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. The gist of this is, though, that when we talk about the executive level position, we see greater representation by both white female and males compared to people of color. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to take a second to breathe here, but the next section of the presentation moves to revenue and sales tax information from 2019. Next slide. So just a couple of caveats here. As you interpret this data, it's important to keep in mind that the reason we looked at 2019 calendar year versus 2020 is because of the exceptional circumstances in 2020, because of deferred tax schedules. The data for 2020 was just not complete. And so as I present this information, I want to be very clear that it is data that is not reflective of the current space or the current state of the cannabis industry. Here, the information that you see represents financial information from one equity-owned permitted cannabis business for 1 month, right? So here, the information, we expect these numbers to look significantly different for 2020 and 2021 because the size of the industry, especially as it relates to equity-owned cannabis businesses, has grown, and those businesses have been in operation for extended periods of time. Here, like I said, the data here reflects one equity-owned business, and it reflects financial information for just 1 month because that particular business was permitted at the end of 2019 and only provided information for 1 year, for 1 month of that year, the final month of that year. Here's another important caveat. As we look at total revenue, the total revenue is an estimation. It's a figure that is calculated based on sales tax data. Now, it's really important to emphasize that the data that we possess through the Office of the Controller or the Treasurer and Tax Collector's Office, it does not speak to the total revenue. That is not data that is provided to either one of those offices. So to the extent that we talk about it here, it is an approximation, and it's one based off of a crude calculation on the sales tax, right? So that's really important to emphasize that these are not precise figures. They are just estimates, and even then, they are incomplete estimates because they are missing a significant chunk of the industry that now exists that didn't in 2019. How accurate is this estimate? For all of the reasons I mentioned, it is an estimate, and that's how it should be interpreted. The data here reflects approximately 127 cannabis businesses that have registered with the city. So to the extent that a cannabis business is not registered with the city or did not self-report information, it would not be reflected in this data. So to that extent, it would be an undercount. And there's a possibility that that may be at play. The other important factor here is, like I mentioned, the data here does not include approximately 20 new businesses that have since opened and that have been in operation for an extended period of time. So please interpret this data with a careful eye because it's not necessarily reflective of today's landscape. Next slide. So with that being said, the estimate that was generated based on the sales tax data, and the sales tax is 1%. So here, the total revenue calculation in 2019 was approximately $237,448,500, and that is by taking a look at the sales tax paid by cannabis businesses that registered with the city and county of San Francisco and multiplying that by essentially 100. Okay, next slide. Again, the information here just reiterates the importance of how to interpret this information. We suspect that the numbers for 2020 and 2021 will look significantly different. Next slide. When we drill a little bit more and look at the sales tax revenue generated by permitted cannabis businesses in 2019, again, keep in mind that this is just self-reported information by those businesses that have registered with the city and county. But as a reference point, when you look at the sales tax generated by each of the types of businesses, you'll see that for Article 16 permit holders in 2019, that sum was $3,780. Again, that's the amount paid by one cannabis business with a permanent permit for 1 month. So it is a very incomplete figure, and it only represents about a 1/12 of the year for one business. Today's landscape looks much different. There are over 20 equity-owned cannabis businesses that have been permitted, and the majority of which have been in operation for more than a year at this point. When we look at the Article 16 temp permit holders, you see that the sales tax paid by these businesses that registered with the city and county and self-reported is a little under $300,000. And when you look at the Article 33 permit holders, medical cannabis dispensaries, you see that the sales tax data is just a little north of $2 million. Okay, next slide. And this brings us to almost the end of today's presentation. One of the other points that we wanted to provide information on was the number of expungements of cannabis convictions in 2020. As many of you are probably predicting, the answer here is, next slide, not applicable, because many of the convictions that would have been expunged in the city and county of San Francisco were proactively expunged by initiative of the district attorney's office after Prop 64 was passed. So in particular, in February 2019, the DA's office proactively cleared a total of 9,363 marijuana-related convictions. When we circled back with the DA's office to see if there were any additional expungements in 2020, the information we received was that there were not. So just a little bit of context for why that number is 0. It's not applicable given the initiative, a local initiative in the city. All right, so that concludes the second part of the OOC's data presentation. A wealth of information. I really do urge anyone who is following along or trying to follow along to take a look at the slides. They will be made available after today's meeting, and a recording of this meeting will also be made available. And if you have any follow-up questions, we're happy to assist at the OOC as well. So with that, I turn it back over to Chair Jamalian. If you have any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you, Nikesh. And yeah, I think I'll just open this up to my fellow committee members. I think it's a pretty data heavy presentation. I remember filling out one of those surveys, so it's nice to see it visualized. Well done. Thank you. That being said, let's open this up for questions for the OOC.
And Chair Jamalian, if you would just humor me for one moment, you reminded me of something. We will be sending out similar surveys soon, and I hope everyone who is following along at this meeting now understands the utility of those surveys. Please do fill them out. The more operators we have who participate in these surveys, the richer the data and the more that can actually be gleaned. As you could see with this survey effort, approximately 141 unique businesses were contacted, and we had complete information from just under 30 businesses. So the response rate was not as high as we would like. We will certainly give you more time to fill it out, but to the extent that you can encourage your fellow operators or operators within the industry to participate, we would very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Nikesh. Yeah, any questions for the OOC?
Sounds like I sufficiently confused everyone to the point where there's not enough clarity to ask a question.
I think there's just a lot to digest here. And I think having that presentation available online for people to go through will probably be quite helpful. I personally look at the data, sort of what you described. It's good data and representative of a snapshot in time, but we have come a long way since that data was generated. I think the 20 equity businesses that are not part of that are going to really bump that up. It is nice to see things like the average wages in our industry. It is nice to see what the entry-level wages are, that most of us operators are trying to create a living wage for our staff and employees. So I think there was some good data there. Again, a lot to digest, and I'll open the floor to anyone else who has a comment.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for giving that information. I'm really, really hoping that in the future that we see on the state level some major tax reform so that not only can we give people better wages, but we can hire more people. And I do believe with tax reform, we will make it more accessible to consumers, which in the end will only bode well for the state for them receiving taxes as well.
Well said, Sarah. Totally agree.
Would the committee members, will we have access to the data sets that this presentation is based on?
That is a good question, Member McGilly. Let me look into that. The data was presented in, let me take a look and we can circle back.
Yeah, I mean, the presentation was rated well, easily digestible, but I think, you know, there might be some nuance in it that some of us might want to do a deeper dive into that.
Yeah, and as full disclosure, the hesitancy on my part is twofold. One, trying to remember the format in which the information was provided, and two, if that raises any privacy concerns that we may need to address, because at the outset we did let people know that information would be confidential. So that's where the hesitation is coming from, just not fully sure, and also trying to keep in mind the privacy implications of play. But we can circle back.
And if I could just say one thing, Nikesh, I'll just chime in and reemphasize the point that you made earlier, which is that I think everyone on this call is concerned about making sure that the cannabis market in San Francisco is equitable and representative. And we can't really know if that's true without collecting good data, and we can't collect good data unless people answer the surveys. So otherwise, we're just reporting on a snapshot of people who answer surveys. But we have to get above a certain threshold for our stuff to be representative. So when we come asking you to fill out a survey, please get your friends to do so, because it's important for knowing what's going on. And big shout out to Nikesh for pulling that all together and presenting. Thank you, Nikesh.
Plenty of help from the operators in particular.
If we don't have any more comments from committee members, I would probably like to open it up for public comment at this time. Ray, would you mind reminding folks how to participate?
Sure thing, Chair Jamalian. I'm going to enable the chat function now, and then I will make the announcement. Members of the general public, again, who want to provide a public comment on this particular item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 145-655-0001, input the access code, which is 24889335496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I'm going to check the attendee list to see if there's anyone waiting to speak. I don't see any individual waiting in queue at this moment. And I'm going to move on to check the chat function now. Chair Jamalian, I do not see any written comments submitted, particularly for this agenda item.
Thank you, Ray. That concludes the.
My apologies. Yeah, we just got one. So this public comment reads, perhaps the OOC can mention to operators that completing the survey can be reported on their equity progress reports, ? And I think that concludes the public comment. Oh, actually, right now we do have one individual waiting to speak, and I'm going to unmute this individual. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide your public comment. You may proceed. Hello, caller. Chair Jamalian, perhaps this is an unattended line.
Thank you, Ray. That concludes the public comment section for this agenda item. If the committee likes to discuss or make any motions regarding this, I do think incentivizing people to fill out the survey is something that the OOC should look into. And I do think, given that a lot of dispensary operators are kind of wondering how to fulfill some of their equity commitment requirements, that's actually a pretty good idea as well. That being said, if any of my committee members want to discuss, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would move to close this item. I guess we can go and close this item. That concludes number 5, and we will take a 15-minute break, I believe, and then we'll come back and hear from a representative of the Department of Public Health regarding the current regulations and the recent health orders.
And with that, the committee will move into a practice session for everyone who is attending. We will be back in 15 minutes, so around 3:01. See everyone soon.
Thank you, Nikesh.
Ray, would you mind moving us into a practice session?
Sure thing.
Everyone, welcome back to the Cannabis Oversight Committee meeting. We will be resuming now. Chair Jamalian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikesh. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to move on to agenda item number 6. At this point, the committee will hear from a representative of the Department of Health regarding the current health order governing consumption lounges, as well as fee waivers and current regulations for operating consumption lounges. And with that, I will pass the floor on to Mohamed Mali from the Department of Public Health.
All right. So as of today, all of the lounges were approved to open for vaping and smoking. That was a restriction that was put in place back in January. That restriction was lifted. So basically allows them to do all the activities they're permitted to do. Some of them have other permits outside of smoking and vaping, which is consuming edibles, minimal preparation of edibles for consumption. The lounges themselves, for individuals to enter, they either have to have proof of vaccination, and most people usually comply with that. If they do not have proof, then they have to have a negative COVID test. So for a negative COVID test, if it's an antigen test, it has to be within 1 day. If it's a PCR test, it has to be within 2 days. But the order itself explicitly states that it cannot be a home test. So those tests, those test results would have to be administered by a lab or by a licensed tester and then sent over to an approved lab. At this point, all the permitted lab or permitted cannabis consumption lounges were notified yesterday of the restriction being removed from the current health order. And they were all very, very happy about that. And I'm sure people are actively consuming as we speak right now. And then I think basically we've been doing a lot of plan check for these consumption lounges. There's a lot of them that are, starting to do construction and moving forward with getting those up and running. But currently we don't have that many. I think there's approximately 7 permitted lounges that are currently operating. And most of them some of those were grandfathered lounges, and some of them are not the grandfathered lounges and had to meet the rules and regulations that we wrote up back in 2018 with the enhanced ventilation systems. So most of those lounges, the ones that meet the that are required to meet the regulations, those are all under negative pressure. So some of them have designated areas just for vaping. Some of them have just one big lounge. Some of them have designated areas for dabbing, and then the rest of it is specifically for vaping and smoking. And with those regulations, in addition to having them be required to be under negative pressure, they have to go through some very, very high efficient filters and odor abatement, some kind of odor abatement. So usually people do a two-pronged approach. They'll do activated carbon filters, they'll do ionizers, and then it'll go through those MERV 11 or MERV 13 filters before it's exhausted out into the public. And that's to ensure that people or businesses within the vicinity of those lounges do not have to inhale those particulates that are exhausted from the smoke. So yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. There's you know, there's a lot. I will say that there are a lot of other municipalities within California and outside that are very interested in our regulations for cannabis consumption. Last week, I spoke to somebody in Boulder, Colorado, and they are actually looking into adopting some of our regulations because they want to allow cannabis consumption, and it's something they're taking very seriously. So I spoke to her for quite some time and explained to her the process of how we got to this point. Berkeley has basically adopted our cannabis consumption rules and regulations verbatim and included them because they want to also allow for that activity. So, you know, I think we're setting a pretty good standard for a lot of people on how this can be done and done properly. So.
That's great.
Thank you, Mohamed. Thank you for that. And before I open up for questions from committee members, do you mind also quickly elaborating on the fee waiver program?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So what we did, because these lounges had not been allowed to operate for a majority of this year and last year, what we're doing is we are providing refunds to the licensed those that are actually permitted by us. So we're providing refunds and we are waiving the fees for the current fiscal year. So, and that's all moving forward. We've sent out the paperwork to those individuals or those licensees that fall under that category. And that's just to make it right, because it's not fair that they were paying for a license that they could not use. So. Any questions?
No question.
Yes,
Chair.
sir.
Chair. So I'm on it. It's Brendan. First of all, I want to just kind of commend you know, you and Doug on the work that you guys have done on these lounges over the years. I think it's been great and innovative, and San Francisco's, you know, being kind of the first in the country to do it is very special. And the fact that all these other cities are looking to us now and looking to you guys for guidance and adopting your regulations is really impressive, and I commend you guys for that work. I am curious a little bit about how, you know, how the dispensary lounges were treated during this past year. I feel like cannabis businesses, I think a lot of us on this panel know that cannabis businesses seem to always kind of be, you know, relegated to the last in line, or you know, put in the least advantageous position in a lot of things. I mean, I think the fact that the stores were able to remain open as an essential use was really important, but it was for medical. You know, I think that was kind of the one of the big supporters of it. And I remember when the lounges first reopened in the summer, last summer, it seemed to be like kind of in line with bars and restaurants, and you know, kind of you know, recreational consumer facilities that allowed consumption of alcohol and food. And then when they were forced to close, I believe it was in July, a lot of those businesses were allowed to reopen, and cannabis lounges were just kind of left behind. And I find that a little odd in light of the fact that these cannabis consumption lounges have these enhanced ventilation, carbon filters, negative pressure. Like I don't think any of these other businesses that I'm aware of have anything even close to that in terms of air filtration. And I think it seems like, unless I'm missing something, that the standard that was used to determine whether or not they should open was a little bit arbitrary. And I'd like to kind of like try to start pinning down DPH a little bit in terms of, why cannabis lounges weren't allowed to reopen when bars were. And in the future, what are going to be the triggers for them to be closed again? And how are we going to ensure that, there's some objective standards that can be measured by, because you are talking about people that need cannabis for medical purposes. It's an essential use. There's the enhanced ventilation systems. I think there's a lot of factors that support reopening these lounges. And so I just wanted to get a little feedback from you, what you have and what you can share with us about, from what happened, in the summer and the fall of last year, why the lounges weren't allowed to reopen, and kind of going forward, how they're going to be treated and what they're going to be, compared against, or what category of use are they going to be put into, so we know, okay, if bars are reopening, cannabis clubs are going to be reopening. If other hookah lounges or cigar bars are reopening, cannabis clubs or cannabis lounges are going to be reopening. And I think it's a really important thing that we begin to kind of create some transparency in this. And I know it means a lot to the small business operators, but also to the medical cannabis community in San Francisco. And also, people who live in apartment buildings. There's been a lot of isolation with COVID. And I think it's the socialization part of it was missed out on by a lot of people. So I just want to send that over to you. It's a lot to unpack, but I'm hoping you can give us some, some light on it, and we can begin to get clear understanding of where we're at and where we're going in the future if we have another variant or another COVID spike.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is Doug and I and environmental health have no say over restrictions or what's implemented in the health order. So that is all up to the health officer and her team. That is also up to the city attorney who works with the health officer. So if you're asking me why they were put into certain categories, I could not answer that. If you're asking me why bars were allowed to open and cannabis lounges had to close, I couldn't answer that. I can tell you that when the health order was changed, and they were going to make those changes, Doug and I basically gave justifications, like you mentioned, as far as the ventilation and all of the safety measures that are taken to ensure that people are vaccinated and everything else like bars. We explained that. We had number of discussions with the team that makes those decisions that is very well above our pay grade, because they don't really understand how they work. And we wanted to make sure that they took those into consideration. But that decision to continue with that restriction was still maintained. So, I think, if the committee itself wants these questions answered and some clear guidance in the future, those questions should probably be directed towards the health officer, because that's who makes those decisions and not Doug and I.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump in. Thank you, Mohamed, for clarifying that, because I was going to jump in and just kind of also just reiterate the fact that you guys are here to give us clarification on current regulations and current enforcement. And I think we can all agree that navigating the last 2 years, a lot of it was arbitrary. Obviously, the cannabis industry, to your point, Brendan, always gets hit a little harder on the ambiguity of code and regulations. But I do think as a committee, we should entertain either writing a letter to the health officer or a recommendation how we do want to be classified going forward. And that's something that this agenda item, we can do during this agenda item. So just something to keep in mind as we, I believe DPH is done. Am I right, Mohamed? I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm totally happy to take questions. I just want to reiterate that as far as the health order and the decisions made towards the health order, it's completely not in Doug's and I's realm as far as that's concerned.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we all know how competent you guys are, especially when it comes to air handling and air exchange. I think the public doesn't realize what we have to facilitate as operators. We're talking 30 to 60 air exchanges an hour in pretty large buildings. To Brendan's point, nobody has to do that except us. So it's good that you guys advise the health department or let them know about your findings. But I do think it's important for us as a committee to make a recommendation to the health department. And after we open up for public comment, we should come back and discuss this and formulate something. And that being said, Ray, if you don't mind opening for public comment and letting the public know how to dial in.
Sure, Chair Jamali. Members of the general public who want to provide public comment on this particular agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, which is available now, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input the access code, which is 2488-933-5496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I'm going to check the attendee list to see if there's anyone waiting to speak at this moment in time. Currently, we have 3 callers waiting in the queue, and I'm going to unmute the first caller. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. You may proceed.
Yes, thank you. This is Bram Goodwin from the San Francisco Social Club. I appreciate that this is on the agenda, and I'm giving my comments from Mo Green's Dispensary Lounge. It is open, and I appreciate that. The only thing I really want to say is I think cannabis should be treated like other things in terms of the risk factor. I live in the Haight. I've been to bars, hookah bars, etc. And it can't be any safer there than it is if we're in a smoking lounge. I'd like to see San Francisco Public Health be more transparent in the reasons that we have a more risk factor situation. And you're hurting businesses and consumers. You're selling a product to someone who can't use it unless they're in a single family house, which is a civil rights issue. So I won't go on and on. I just want to see more transparency, more communication, and I want to see our very few consumption sites be open. Thank you for allowing my comment. And thanks for the committee for taking care of this.
Thank you for your comment. We are going to move on to the next call. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. You may proceed. Hello, caller. Chair Jamalian, looks like this is another unattended line. I'm going to move on to the next caller in the queue. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. Please proceed.
Hi, my name is Malcolm Joshua White, and I just want to thank everybody on the committee for, this has been very informative. My question is on the topic of lounges, of course, and I wanted to ask the DPH if there's any opportunity in the near future to have a non-infused food, so not food without cannabis in it, available for sale in lounges in San Francisco, whether that's not non-alcoholic as well, but just like sodas and things of that nature, just food in general.
Yeah. So
Thank you for
remarks
your
that-
comment.
Thank you for your comment. Mohamed, we'll discuss this after public comment is closed and
sorry.
the discussion
Okay.
round. We're
My
not
bad.
allowed to address him directly, but I think that was a very, very useful comment.
Thank you, Chair Jamalin. I'm personally curious to know too. But let's move on to the rest of the public comment. Chair Jamalian, we do not have any written public comments submitted for this agenda item, and I'm going back to the attendee list to check one last time to see if there's anyone waiting to speak. Seeing none, I think we can conclude this public comment session. Chair Jamalian.
And Ray, just before you close it, as a matter of point for anyone who is called in and it's been an unattended line or you've had technical difficulty getting through, feel free to either email the Office of Cannabis with your public comment and we can read that into the record, or to submit it via chat if you are on the call and able to see the screen. We certainly want to make sure that your voice is heard, and if there is a technical difficulty, there are other ways to contribute as well.
Thank you for reiterating that, Nikesh. That concludes our public comment section. And with that, I would open the floor to discussion regarding creating a clear and sort of unambiguous classification of consumption lounges. Also to one of the public comments was speaking to that we should get treated like another industry, whether that's cigar and hookah lounges or bars. And I think now all of our curiosity has been triggered by the last comment. So Mohamed, what is the plan on food and beverage there?
So honestly, it's the state that's really hindering that ability. So for when we actually wrote the rules and regulations, there was a letter that we sent over to, at that time, the BCC, because we were hoping that our type B permits would allow for a little bit of creativity, right? We're not asking somebody to be able to be making the product that's not packaged and labeled, but we sent almost a 2-page document over asking them if somebody could heat up a brownie. So we're focusing. You got to remember, Doug and I are also food inspectors, so we understand how that works. So what the state law says is that you cannot sell anything other than cannabis products and cannabis branded merchandise. What they started finding was some dispensaries, to get around that, were branding candy and chips under their brand. So that was branded merchandise. So then they included language that said you can't sell any food that falls under the definition of food under the California Retail Food Code. So that is the hindrance, because we said, well, what if somebody wants to heat up a brownie and they want to put infused chocolate syrup on it and a cherry or something and put it on a plate? And they were like, no. We said, well, what if somebody wants to make some kind of smoothie with an infused product? And they were like, no. And everything was no, 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 no. So it's not DPH that is not allowing it. It's the state regulations that clearly state that the only items that can be sold in a dispensary are properly tested cannabis, packaged, labeled, and properly tested cannabis products and branded merchandise. So again, that is not something that we are preventing them. That's something that the state is preventing them from doing.
It just goes to show just the disconnect between regulations and also what the consumer wants and also what's good for the consumer. I mean, I appreciate the thought of putting infused syrup on a brownie, but sometimes someone just smokes and has the munchies and wants a regular Snickers. So
Exactly. Yeah.
So to kind of prohibit that is also not conducive for the consumer safety. If you have someone with low blood sugar, they should have access to a soda or something in a consumption lounge. I think we should and we can't do anything about it, but that's something that I think on an individual level, everyone should advocate the state for looking at that again, because that seems like a really big disconnect. But thank you for clarifying it, and I'm sure Malcolm will appreciate that his question has been somewhat answered.
Yeah, the one thing that we have told the cannabis lounge owners is there is no prohibition if somebody that's in the lounge wants to order food and have it brought into the lounge, right? So one person, and this is the crazy part, right? So
Makes no
the
sense.
dispensary can't sell the food product, but there's no prohibition that says you can't bring food into the lounge. Yeah. Yep. So that is something we brought up. One lounge owner was like, so if I bought the cafe next door, I could start having people deliver food. So it's very, very similar. That whole idea is very similar to that cafe in Hollywood, right? So they own a restaurant next door, and then they have the consumption area adjacent to it. And what people do is they will go and they will order the food from the restaurant next door, and then it'll be brought into the consumption area.
That makes no sense.
Team up with your local restaurants. I guess that's the only thing.
You know, it's nice, but
thanks for
bringing food in is
clarifying
awesome.
again. And Brennan, I think, or since you might want to redeem yourself on that first motion, if you wanna, we should probably find some verbiage, what we do want to recommend to the health officer and the department regarding the classification of consumption lounges. If my fellow committee members will help work that out, so we can make a motion and vote on that, and hopefully send that recommendation over to the Department of Health.
Chair Jamali, if I just may make a suggestion, David, would you mind sharing your screen and just sort of taking notes so that way the public can follow along and there's a recitation if need be that's readily available? Thank you.
It seems to me, just like as a starting point, that bars are the most basic comparison. I mean, and you know, if anything, you're in a bar a lot longer than you're in a cannabis consumption lounge, and it's probably higher risk because you're sitting there for longer, and people tend to get looser with following rules when they're drinking. So I don't know. I would, you know, just for open kind of discussion with the other committee members, you know, I would lean towards trying to kind of tether the cannabis consumption lounge to the bar regulations, or for, you know, opening and closing pandemic influenced.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a logical level, I agree. I believe, Mohamed, please correct us if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that it's more likely to be classified as a cigar or hookah lounge.
Yeah, the way I was looking at it through the health order that I sent out to those lounges, they have those all clumped up together. So they have it as hookah lounges, cigar bars, and cannabis lounges. So that is how they have decided to classify them.
And are the hookah lounges and cigar bars, are they subject to similar HVAC requirements as the cannabis businesses are?
From my understanding, no. So the hookah lounges, so as far as the hookah lounges, from my understanding, there's these lava rocks that they're using to smoke, I guess, because the smoking ban inside of establishments. So that's how they've got around it. There are these, I don't know everything that entails around these rocks that they're smoking. They're like infused with something that kind of tastes like the hookah tobacco. And from what I know, I think there is one cigar bar that was grandfathered in and allowed to smoke inside. And that was through some special legislation that was included quite a while ago.
Smoking rocks doesn't sound good.
I was waiting for someone to say it.
I was very careful as I was trying to note that.
I'm just trying to tell you guys how it works. That's what I know. That's all I know. I have not looked at them.
Smoke rocks, but no weed.
That's just what I've been told.
I think, Brendan, to your point, then I do think we should, as a body, push for tethering it to bars rather than, because what we're talking about right now is a delivery mechanism when we really should be talking about the air safety in the building, right?
Correct.
So just because it's a similar delivery mechanism shouldn't make it subject to something that's well below the building code requirements that we have to adhere to. So,
And the one thing I will say, I'm just giving you information, okay? But one thing I'll say is, let's just say for the ventilation requirements, right? If you're a restaurant or a bar, the health order says that you should keep the doors and windows open. And that's all fine and dandy, right? But that is nothing compared to the enhanced ventilation system that these dispensary lounges have in place. We're talking these, and just so everyone is fully aware of how this works. If I was a cannabis operator when open a lounge, I couldn't write up my proposal and provide it to myself and Doug. The proposal has to come from a licensed mechanical engineer, and it has to be stamped and signed by a licensed mechanical engineer. And they are basically saying and putting their license online that this system will work exactly the way that I said it's going to work. And it will comply with all of your regulations, and it'll meet the noise requirements and everything else. Just so everyone has a little bit of background, there was one existing dispensary that did not have a lounge. They decided to build out the lounge, but because of the weight and the amount of equipment that had to be put on a roof, they actually had to go and reinforce the roof itself before they could even start, because of the amount of equipment that is needed to ensure that it is in full compliance with our rules and regulations. So you all have heard, and I'm just giving you guys some maybe some talking points, but you all have heard since the beginning of this that ventilation is really important. Ventilation is really important, right? And that's because of to prevent the spread. Well, these lounges are pretty close to almost like the way they're engineered is almost like if somebody were to enter the hospital, they have a very, very rare communicable disease, they would be put in the special room with negative pressure, and it's a complete separate HVAC system. And so with the lounges that we license, those HVAC systems are not part of the entire dispensary's HVAC system. It's a completely separate HVAC system to prevent the migration of smoke into units above the lounge or into the rest of the lounge, and clearly to ensure that it's exhausted out without going inside of any other area out in that building. Does that make sense?
yes, thanks again, Mohamed, for I think the public especially, it's really informative and putting it into this kind of context. It is hospital grade filtration, literally. So I think that's really important to mention. I would start moving towards wording this.
It seems almost like, and I don't know how we go about doing this. We've done this before last year before I was on, but it seems to me like writing a letter on behalf of our committee to the health officer would be something I would support. I don't know how we go about drafting it or how that's delegated, but what Mohaned's saying here is, the fact that there's separate HVAC systems that are, with the negative pressure and are scrubbing air at a rate, beyond what, ventilations are available for restaurants and bars, and it's powerful, you know, and I think also I hate to kind of compare cannabis to bars because I know that I'm a big medical cannabis person, and so I got involved with this, and I don't compare cannabis usage straight to alcohol usage. But I'm trying to think of like, I mean, maybe it's not far-reaching enough alcohol, in light of what we're saying about the ventilation system. It seems like there was a big whiff on, objectively looking at the safety issue here, like the risk issue with these dispensaries. Pardon me, with these consumption rooms. So, I mean, I would even be open to going further than bars, but particularly like because of the medical side of this. But at the same time, I want to be effective and be taken seriously by them. And obviously, I don't want to create something that seems to put safety aside for for cannabis consumption. I mean, safety is number one. But I don't know. Have we done a letter before? How would we go about doing that if we wanted to put our motion into an actual written letter to the health officer?
I can provide a little bit of precedent here. So in the past, when there was a position that the Oversight Committee wanted to take with respect to the ban on smoking inside residential dwelling units, there was a letter that was crafted by a member of the committee, and that letter was then circulated amongst the committee. Once it was approved, it was then circulated to the appropriate leadership. So to answer your question, the precedent is that a letter could be drafted by a committee member or sort of in a joint fashion. But the challenges with drafting a letter in a joint fashion is that you have to be very careful not to butt up against the rules regarding meetings, public meetings. So the minute you have more than quorum essentially touching a similar letter, then that turns into a meeting. So if one of you wrote a letter, then pass it along to somebody else, they pass it along to somebody else, and you got to 5 members, that would be in violation of the Brown Act. So typically what we've seen in the past is one member will draft the letter. That letter will be sent, that letter will be included as a part of a meeting as a part of the materials for the next meeting. That will be published to the public. They'll have an opportunity to take a look at it. The committee will review it at the next meeting, and then a vote can be made, and that would be in a public setting. So to answer your question, Brendan, one person drafts a letter, they circulate it through RDA. RDA will then send it to us. We'll make it publicly available. The public will have an opportunity to review it before the next meeting. Then the committee will convene at the next meeting and take a vote on that particular letter. If they pass it, then it'll get circulated to the appropriate leadership through RDA. If they do not pass it and it needs to be revised, then it'll be a rinse and repeat of the same process in advance of the next meeting.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you.
And I think, Brendan, the 30 days will kind of give us enough time to do a little bit of the research you just mentioned to aim for something that's comparable, but not throwing a Hail Mary, so to speak. But I do think that gives us the time. So maybe a motion to draft this letter for review in the next agenda would probably be the most straightforward way. And I think I was part of that with Nikesh one. So it is very possible. I think we got it out within one meeting. It was voted upon. So yeah, I would.
I'd be happy to draft the letter if you want to work on it together. Two of us could work on it together, right?
As long as the two of you are not having communications with any of the other members who might then have communications about it with someone else, it's fine. It's called an in seriatim meeting, which we have to. Yeah. So yes, if it's just the two of you and no one else, that should be fine.
It's good. I think I'm happy to write the letter, but I think it's good to have it come from the chair as well. So.
I mean, I've walked through this HVAC exercise a few times, so I think.
Yeah, you know it. You know it well as better than I do technically. So.
All right. Well, then if somebody wants to make a motion, I think we can move on that.
Okay, I will make a motion.
I'll second your motion.
Make a motion to draft a letter in support of more equitable treatment of cannabis lounges with the health officer for the next meeting, for review at the next meeting.
Second.
Okay, moving to a vote. Seat 8, Ali, how do you vote?
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn, how do you vote?
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 12, Sean Richard.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Holloman.
Aye.
Seat 16, Sarah Pan.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, David. That concludes agenda item number 6. Then we will open up for general public comment. After that, we will have a brief discussion on in-person meetings. So for now, I would move on to agenda item number 7, general public comment. With that, Ray, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Chair Jamalian. Members of the general public who want to provide public comment on this agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input the access code, which is 24889335496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I'm going to check to see if there's anyone waiting to speak in the queue. We do have a few individuals waiting, and I'm going to unmute the first individual. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. You may proceed. Hello? Maybe we can circle back to this individual later.
And Ray, if I might just suggest, for the individual who is calling and having trouble patching through, feel free to shoot the Office of Cannabis an email, and we might be able to read your comment live. But if you are the same individual who's had trouble a couple of times now, please do reach out via email, and we will monitor that inbox and try and incorporate it into this public comment portion.
Thank you, Nikesh. And to your point, members of the general public who want to provide your public comment after the meeting, we'll be happy to include that as a part of the public record of this meeting. So if you are having any technical difficulties calling in or submit your question right now, you can do so after this meeting. So with that, Chair Jamalian, I'm going to unmute the second individual waiting in line to speak. Hello, caller, it's your turn. You may proceed.
Oh, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Yeah. Okay, my name's Angela Fong. I'm born and raised in San Francisco, and I'm third generation in this Russian Hill, Nob Hill area of San Francisco. A dispensary, I guess public notice occurred on February 4th. Where they want to build a dispensary right in front of a major bus stop on Pacific Avenue. So the license is for 1196 Pacific Avenue. And while I understand that we would love to have city revenue coming in, as well as employment for so many, people that need jobs, this Nob Hill, Russian Hill neighborhood definitely is not commercial. It's residential as well as upscale. So I did write to your San Francisco Office of Cannabis, and I received a quick response within 2 hours. I'm really impressed with that, and I thank all of you for your responsiveness to that. And we will be proceeding with, I guess, contacting our community liaison and contacting the Planning Commission. But at this point, I have a couple questions. What phase of the building of this dispensary is it at this stage, since the meeting that was that we had on Zoom for the Good Neighbor meeting, as well as notice of pre-application meeting, took place on February 4th? How much can we do to try to fight this? Because 95% of my entire neighborhood is hugely opposed against this. It's not the right venue. Nothing against cannabis or anybody who uses it for any need, medicinal or other, but this is just not the right location in this Russian Hill, Nob Hill area. Does anyone have anything we can do to try to start petitioning or what? Because it doesn't belong here in this neighborhood.
Thank you for your comment.
Chair Jamalian, I'm going to move on to the next caller. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment. You may proceed.
This is Graham Goodwin again. I enjoyed following the last person. I just wanted to comment that I'd like to see more in these meetings, especially orientation to consumers, because the consumers in the end are paying the freight. They're paying the high prices, the high taxes, lack of access. So that's my only comment. I'd just like to see it more incorporated. I appreciate drafting this letter on the lounges, which I think is important. I think it's just getting our message out to everybody, especially the public, that this is a good thing actually and has a lot of benefits to the community. So thank you all on the committee for your service. From Muhammad, I appreciate much of the detail. Look forward to the letter, and the cannabis lounges are open, so enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Bram.
Right, Chair Jamalian, I'm going to move on to the check function. At this moment in time, we do not have any public comment in writing submitted to this particular item. I think that concludes our public comment section.
Thank you. That concludes agenda item number 7. Moving on to agenda item number 8, which we added in the beginning regarding in public meetings. I think we can open up for public comment. We've had a previous discussion, so we can open up. Oh, we don't have to have public comment because it's just a discussion, correct?
Because it's been added to the agenda, you would still need to have a public comment portion. You just won't be permitted to issue a vote or recommendation on, or issue a vote on the particular item.
Okay, well, in that case, I would open up for public comment before we do the committee discussion.
All right, thank you, Chair Jamalian. Members of the general public, again, who want to provide public comment on this particular agenda item can do so by submitting your written comment through the chat function, or you can dial 1-415-655-0001, input the access code, which is 2488-933-5496, and press *3 when prompted to do so. You will be unmuted when it's your turn to speak, and each individual will have 2 minutes to provide your public comment. Chair Jamalian, I do not see any written comments submitted to this item, and I'm going to check the attendee list. We have 2 individuals waiting to speak, and I'm going to unmute the first individual. Hello, caller. It's your turn. Please proceed. Chair Jamalian, looks like it's the same line as the last agenda item. And then I will move on to the next one. Hello, caller. It's your turn to provide public comment for this particular agenda item. Please proceed.
Sorry about that. No comment on this item. Thank you.
Thank you for the confirmation. I think that concludes our public comment section. Chair Jamalian.
Thank you, Ray. And with that, I open the floor to my fellow committee members regarding in-person meetings. I personally do think they're very effective when we're in person, but I also really do see Sarah's point. So that being said, it'd be probably good to hear everyone's view. If you guys want to go in order or just chime in, please, floor is yours.
And Chair Jamalian, the OOC is also happy to provide some information if it's helpful. I know Member McGilly had a question earlier that we said we would address later. So when the time is appropriate, we're happy to provide context and factors if it's helpful.
Oh, please go ahead. I mean, I do think the discussion will end up leading to sort of the desire for a hybrid meeting. And given that you said there's a lack of media support, probably the best time for you to take the floor is right away.
Sure. So a couple of factors to consider, but I'll jump straight into the one that you addressed at the very tail end of this of your comment. So it's my understanding that certain types of public bodies, commissions in particular, are mandated to meet in person after a certain point in time. in an effort to make those meetings still publicly accessible, there have been resources allocated for just those meetings that would provide audio and video support to ensure that they're available to those who cannot attend or do not feel comfortable attending. What that does, though, is that it puts a limitation on how available those resources might be for those meetings that choose to voluntarily meet in person. And that's all to say that those same resources will not be available. And to the extent that the committee would want to explore ways to move to a hybrid model, they would be costs that would be borne outside of any process that the city might be able to just naturally afford for the meetings that are required to meet in person. Some of the reasons for that are exactly what Member Payan mentioned, just as a safety concern. One of the other factors that I think is just a practical consideration here is meeting space, right? Given that there are ongoing COVID concerns, there would be there would be certain types of actual venues that could support these meetings depending on the size of the audience. For members themselves, if they've provided their vaccine information, which all of you had to, it would be less of a concern. But in terms of supporting an audience of, let's say, 20 people, so today's attendees ranged in the vicinity of about 20, and in the past I know we've gotten as large as 50, you would need a room where you could space people out appropriately, and that could create public access issues because you don't necessarily know the size of a meeting until you get there. And if the room is not big enough to support it, there's concerns there. The other concern is just availability. So the larger rooms might be booked up for these meetings that.
I think consumption lounges are pretty safe space to hold these meetings, but
You're a mind reader.
Chair Jamali, I heard that last comment. It certainly seems that way, right?
No, I do think, I think your points are all make sense, and at the end of the day, I also really do see Ryan and Sarah's point. The question is if we don't move to something like trying to hold one in-person meeting every 3 meetings, and that would maybe even allow some of our, we could have an agenda in a way where some of the people that are not comfortable could actually, or could either attend, via a FaceTime or via a some sort of teleconferencing tool, or it's a meeting where they can't attend anyway for other reasons. So I do think there is some creativity that we can have here. I really do agree with Brendan's point that after the in-person meetings, time and time over again, equity applicants, people that are thinking about applying, or people that are already in phase 1 or 2. There's a lot of questions and a lot of wealth in this in our of knowledge in our committee to share. And I would hate to just have deny that access, especially when it comes to compassionate health care. That would be Sarah's point. You know more about it than most of us. Picking Brendan's brain is always interesting for someone who's along the permitting process. So how do we facilitate that? Because I think that's where the spirit of wanting to meet in person is coming from.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I can certainly chime in a little bit. So if the hybrid model is what you're proposing, where it's not a hybrid within each meeting, but a hybrid where the majority of the meetings are remote, and then there is one meeting that is in person and it's well scheduled, then I think there is just some administrative and practical questions for the committee to decide amongst themselves. The first I would think is every member's comfort level to actually appear in person, right? And what that would look like. And I think that would drive the conversation in terms of the type of space we would be looking for and how possible it would be to secure in advance. But I think that would be the starting point, right? What are members' own comfort levels around appearing in public? If there is consensus there, then we don't have a quorum issue. If there is not consensus there, then we possibly have a quorum issue and you can't have the meeting in general, right? So that's part of it. Once that is sorted out, then the next question would become what goes on the agenda. And if it's a particularly weighty item, for instance, it's going to draw a lot of public attention, then I think that's something to consider, because it may be harder to have that particular meeting in public versus a meeting where it may be less well attended because the items are more niche. So I would say that the first order of business is who would want to attend in person. The second is what would actually be discussed during that particular item, that meeting. I think you would have to craft it in a way where they're less substantive, or not substantive, but less popular items where you might be able to accommodate that meeting in a smaller space. To be frank, I think the possibility of having some sort of video conferencing at that meeting would be very difficult to secure. It's not to say that you couldn't, but I think it would be very challenging. I would think that part of the reason why not all public advisory bodies are mandated to meet in person has to do with capacity and technology issues more than anything else. So just some factors to consider. Those are three things off the top I can think of.
And I do remember when we had the industry meeting with SFPD had organized those breakout rooms. I guess this is just kind of from the top of my head, but we could also have a virtual committee meeting where our agenda items would be 2 hours and 1 hour of breakout rooms with each individual committee member for industry peers to break in and ask questions. I don't know how are we even allowed to do that as individual members to engage with the public?
Yeah, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky because I don't know the exact cover of the law enforcement meeting, but if it's not a meeting that has to subscribe to Brown Act rules, then they can do breakouts and they don't have to be noticed. The public doesn't have to have access to it in the same way. Here, I think the challenge, and we can certainly look into this, but the challenge would be that if you had a meeting where all of the members were initially present, and then there were breakout rooms where members were separated into separate sections or areas, then there's a question of, do you still have quorum, right, for that meeting to continue? It would be harder to continue to follow all of the rules. So even if you had breakouts, well, you wouldn't, from a number standpoint, you wouldn't be able to because quorum is at 5, there's 9 voting members. So I think there's some logistical challenges or regulatory challenges to having breakout sessions.
Nikesh, that's my understanding as well, having looked at previously to my understanding that breakout rooms are not.
Could we do a poll to go back to Nikesh's original idea to see what the appetite for in-person meetings are where each member, I think otherwise we're just going to keep talking in circles because until we really know how many members want to show up in person and how many don't, there's really nothing to discuss. Because to your point, everyone has to be comfortable, and that is obviously the #1 priority.
Yeah, recognizing that there are 6 members present today, so there are 3 members whose voices we wouldn't be able to capture today anyway. But yes, that's a good point.
Any other comments from my fellow committee members? Yes, please.
So I think that there are pros and cons with accessibility for both, whether when we meet in person, like you said, there is that time where, you're able to have those close conversations with people and connect, and that's very rich and important. But then there are also people who will not be able to attend the meetings in person because, and not just myself, but other people who are nervous about the state of affairs with that. I think a hybrid model would be a great thing. If it was a in-person meeting, and of course we're in the midst of, like what we've been dealing with for the past few weeks, I wouldn't be able to attend. But if we were in a time where it was calmer and cases weren't up, I'd be amenable to that. So there's just a lot going on with that. And I just wanted to add that I do see both sides of it.
Yeah, I feel that's like that in being inclusive of everybody, accessible to everybody is more important. But I think it's something that we just kind of got to play by ear. Like I wouldn't really want to have a public meeting, to Sarah's point, where 20 or 30% of people that want to attend can't attend. I'd rather do it virtually and have 100% of people attend than have that. I do like to be accessible to people, and I feel like we get also ideas from people that we can put on the agenda. We can hear their viewpoints about that we're not really getting right now, I don't think. Although we're speaking out, going to the lounges, going to dispensaries the past couple of weeks, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of people that I haven't talked to for a long time. But I would say, why don't we just like check in on it like monthly here, and if things continue to go in the right direction, to Sarah's point, we may say, hey, let's take a stab at one in a couple months. But there's no rush to do it. I think being inclusive is more and accessible is more important at this time.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement there. So if there's no more comments, I think we can adjourn the meeting. Correct, Nikesh?
That's correct.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
See everyone later. And with that, the meeting of the Cannabis Oversight Committee is concluded. Ray, if you wouldn't mind transitioning us to a practice session before ending the recording, that would be